Hello, I'm Rod Dreher with the European Conservative, and I'm joined today by Professor Louis Vetting, who is the co-translator and editor of a new book of collected political essays of the French intellectual Rénaud Camus. Professor Vetting, welcome. And what precisely is the title of your book?
It's called Enemy of the Disaster, collected political essays of Rénaud Camus. And we chose the title Enemy of the Disaster because that's, he speaks of his enemies, the people who are ruining France and Europe with bad education and immigration policies, as the friends of the disaster, right? So I decided to give him this nice little handle, Enemy of the Disaster. So I hope it flattered him.
Well, tell me, who is Rénaud Camus and why should we care about him?
Well, the notorious way that he's known is through the term Great Replacement, which he came up with in French, Grand Remplacement, back in the mid-90s when he noticed certain towns and villages in southern France had a very different population from the one that he had seen when he was younger. So populations that were, North African, Arab, Muslim. And so he coined that term. And that was innocent enough at the time. But, in the last 10 years, we've seen the English translation of that term, Great Replacement, come up in the manifestos of mass shooters, specifically in Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso, Texas, right? And that idea is also attached to a notion of a kind of vicious or insidious conspiracy, right? That there's a conspiracy on the part of who knows who to replace white European or American populations with brown and black immigrants from third world countries and other places. So his name is associated with this term, which is attached to a notion of conspiracy. The problem, though, is that that's a total misrepresentation of what Camus actually thinks. If you read him carefully, and even not that carefully, you realize pretty quickly that this guy wants nothing to do with conspiracy theorizing. But nonetheless, he's become kind of, as you put it in your question to me, a kind of bête noire of right-wing or far-right thinking. And, that wouldn't be so significant if Camus had always had a career sort of as a right-wing intellectual. But he was completely the opposite for most of his career, right? He's gay. He was very much a socialist in his early days. So the issue with him is that he kind of betrayed the world that he belonged to. He was not the sort of person who was supposed to theorize in this way or point these kind of things out. So he did something in his criticism of mass migration that was just not what one does in respectable society in France.
Right. He went off the reservation. To his class.
Right. Precisely. Right. So that's what makes him specifically interesting, right? Because he, as you said, he's a traitor. Mm-hmm.
Now, when I first heard about Rénaud Camus, I bought the typical received media line on him that he was a far-right conspiracy theorist, and therefore we didn't have to pay attention to him. But when I read his work in your translation, I realized, wait a minute, this is not it at all. And as you said earlier, he actually goes to some great lengths to distance himself from conspiracy theorists. So what is the Great Replacement according to him, and why is it not a conspiracy?
Well, I think here the best thing to do is distinguish between a machination on the one hand and a conspiracy. So a conspiracy, obviously that implies that there's a direct agential effort to have some sort of effect on, in this case, the demographic composition of Europe. But when you talk about a machination, right, the word machine is central there, and the machine doesn't have a will. It doesn't have an agency. It just sort of plods along inexorably. So in that sense, and that's the sense that Camus intends the term, a great replacement is a kind of zeitgeist or spirit of the times. A concordance of circumstance is a way to think about it, and very much a matter of observation, right? And what brings the great replacement into being, or replacism more generally, is, if we want to simplify, but not too much, this kind of unholy alliance between anti-racism that has jumped the rails and become dogmatic, and we often associate that now with the term wokeism, right? Mm-hmm. And then the interest of capital and economic expediency, which benefits from open borders and cheap labor and a continuing influx of clients for products, right? So again, Camus is on the machination side, and it may seem like a subtle distinction or one that's not that important, but it's actually a vital distinction, because when you're talking about a conspiracy, you have to think about conspirators, right? You start imagining hidden enemies, people working behind the scenes to do something insidious and evil, and that plays into the fantasies and the delusions of paranoid people, violent people, murderous people, white supremacists, and the like. But if you think about it in terms of a machination, and again, that's Camus' view, it becomes a way of understanding our particular historical moment. And as I just said, understanding our moment as this strange, rather unholy conjunction of two interests that would otherwise probably not have a lot in common with each other: the woke side and the kind of free market extreme side of things.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's been pointed out in our own situation in the United States that open borders has benefits for both the left, who want cultural diversity, and big business right, who want cheap labor, and they all benefit.
Right, precisely. Yeah, that's it.
Now, if you live in Europe or paid attention at all to European affairs, you know that mass migration from the Middle East and Africa is a huge issue. Yet addressing it forthrightly has been fairly taboo, not only in France itself, but where Camus lives, but all throughout Europe. Why is this?
Well, I mean, that connects us to the question that you just asked. On the one hand, there's the issue of growth at all costs. It's well known that the populations of Europe and places like Japan too are predicted to decline, right? Because the native indigenous populations there, white Europeans in places like Italy, France, are not producing at the level you need, 2.1 children on average per woman to maintain and grow the population. And that's a terrible problem, if you're a businessman who wants to sell his product. So there's an economic anxiety there that immigration solves. I mean, you can go on the UN websites and find reports that talk very explicitly about replacement migration to solve this very problem. And on the other hand, you have the anti-racist or woke ideology that is very committed to open borders, multiculturalism, and initially that's a response to the horrors of nationalism that almost destroyed Europe. So there's a sense to it. It's just that it's gone off the rails, right, and become maladaptive, and it's starting to bring in the very problems in Europe that it wanted to avoid, right, which is chaos, fragmentation, disorder, like we see on the streets recently in London, France. And there's another aspect to it too. I mean, I think a lot of people who are in charge, they realize that they've created a very bad situation, but it's very easy to just kick the can down to the next government because you don't want to be the one who's at fault. But yeah, again, it's this unholy alliance between two forces, growth and ideology, really working together to create this volatile situation that we see flaring up, especially right now.
Well, yeah, here in Europe, the mass demonstrations by Muslim immigrants and native-born Muslims here in Europe in favor of Hamas after the October 7th massacre have scared the hell out of a lot of people. And it's now undeniable to Europeans that a very large number of their fellow citizens hold violently anti-Semitic views. Now, do you anticipate in light of this that Rénaud Camus' work will find its way closer to the mainstream?
I don't know. I think his ideas, in a way, already have. They're being laundered through various prominent, popular intellectuals that don't have his notorious reputation. So the term "great replacement" itself, or "grand remplacement," to use the French, because it's so weighed down by these connotations, right, with mass shooters and white supremacy, may, I think, very unfairly be irrecoverable. Right? And Camus may himself, in the French context. In the English-speaking context, I'm much more hopeful. But as I said, his ideas, right, I think are being very effectively passed through other thinkers. There are people like Mathieu Bocoté or Driss Ghali, who's a Franco-Moroccan writer who is very critical of mass migration into Europe. And, you know, but he does it in a way that doesn't make explicit reference to this terminology that's become kind of toxic. So even Rusty Rénaud in the latest print version of First Things, he talks about the Great Forgetting, which I think is a pretty clear reference to what Camus calls the Great Deculturation, which is the destruction of the education system. So I think he may suffer the unfortunate fate of being the master thinker of a lot of guiding ideas going forward, but who doesn't get credit for them. I hope that's the case, but it might very well be the case.
Yeah. Well, Camus believes that there is and must be an organic connection among culture, identity, and citizenship, that the people who live in a place have to share in its culture. What does he mean by that? What are its limits? And why is this even controversial in France, where they're very proud of their culture?
Right, those are really good questions. Well, I mean, the simple answer is that people have to have a shared history, right? And that shared history needs to unfold on a certain territory, right? We're human beings who are limited in time and space, and those are just the constraints on us. The question is, first off, how do you ensure that kind of continuity from generation to generation? In other words, how do you continue culture? Well, the easiest way, I think, the most common sense way is simply through filiation, right? You have children, and just by default, you pass on your language, your culture, your religion, and that's how cultures are built up over time, right? And things like ethnicity and race get overlaid right on top of that. But Camus is in a position where he does not take that more practical path. He says, there are already too many people on the planet. He has very particular ecological convictions that take him very much onto the left kind of green side of things. So to, for example, try to, what's the way to put it? To reduce the pressure or the demographic pressure from immigrants, right? To ward off the Great Replacement, you could conceivably just commit to having Europeans have more children. But he doesn't want to have anything to do with that because he thinks there's already too many people on the planet. So, right, that's off the table. The other way to do it, I think, is religion, right? I think that's, other than natural filiation, probably the most powerful way to pass along a culture in lieu of, right, pure biological filiation. But he rejects that too. He says, Christianity is a kind of a half-dead religion in Europe, and it's faced with a very lively religion in Islam, so it's really not up to the task. So his idea is, mass subsidizing of culture through government. He talks about the first thing he would do if he were president of the Republic is create a radio station and a television station that are explicitly committed to culture, and not just any kind of culture, but high culture. So that's his idea, and I think there is some room for thinking that's perhaps not the best way to approach things, but in any case, that's what he thinks. But as you said, why is this controversial in France to take this stance? It seems kind of commonsensical. Well, France is the country of abstraction, right? It's the country of rational citizenship, where you and I and whoever else wants to be French decides, right, through an act of reason that we're going to join this polity. And so, when we do that, we take on certain responsibilities and we're granted certain rights. And in a way, that's the brilliance of France and the brilliance of the Enlightenment in Europe, that we have this notion of citizenship that can be open to people regardless of their origins. But his criticism is that goes too far. There's a whole other side of belonging that is not the republic, but the nation. And the nation is often, or the republic poses itself as the nation, forgetting that France has a deep history, right, that goes well before the Enlightenment. And again, that is linked to a particular place, right, a territory, and that you can't just wish that away through an act of will. So it becomes controversial because the Republican French notion of national belonging is supposed to push aside questions of origins, right? But now, again, as we're seeing in Europe, these questions of origins are really becoming unavoidable, right? Because peoples have remained peoples who have come from elsewhere.
Yeah, well, your answer anticipates my next question, which is based on Camus' statement that a people that knows its classics will not allow itself to be replaced. What does he mean by that?
Well, to know your classics, that means, more generally to know your literature, to know your art, to appreciate your language, to know your religion, all the things that we can think of as constituting culture in the big C kind of sense, right? And to know those things is to have them revealed to you as something that is unique, right, and can't be replaced. I mean, imagine, what would you substitute or what would you replace the cathedral at Chartres with, for example? Right, it's not a thing that you can do.
Sam's Club?
Right? Sam's Club, the sort of universal Walmart. So in that sense, culture is the enemy, right, of replacism. Right, the replacist ideology wants to turn human beings into what Camus calls undifferentiated human matter, right? Something that is rootless, deracinated, has no sense of its past, and can just be molded into whatever the interests of those in power, the interests of money want it to be.
Perfect consumer.
Yeah, the perfect consumer. So it's like, imagine, Walmart already has North America, but imagine if you could turn everyone into a Walmart consumer, and not just turn them into a Walmart consumer, but turn them into somebody who desires to consume at Walmart. And it was the entire global market, right? That's kind of a, an insidious kind of fantasy. So,
but it's a real one. I had a friend visiting here in Budapest last weekend from Ireland, and he's lived in Ireland for 20 years. And he said over the course of that 20 years, he's seen it go from a very distinct place with its own distinct culture into a place where the young see it as primarily a market. That's their first. That's their primary identification of their country, and that is something very new there, he says.
Yeah, new and really kind of tragic, especially from Camus' point of view. I mean, his work is so much a lament about what's being lost.
Yeah. Well, it's to think of it that way is to think of the classics in literature, art, music, and so forth as protecting a culture. It makes me think naturally that wokeism, or as I call it in France now, le wokisme, is a precursor to dissolving a culture. If you taint everything within a particular culture with racism or what some other ism that makes it dirty and something to be thrown into the trash bin of history, then you can be replaced.
Right, and I think that when we talk about, I mean, there are always think pieces being written every year by this or that professor about the value of the humanities, and there are often things like, well, when you study the humanities, it's an opportunity for moral improvement, right? Or to elevate your aesthetic sensibility. But those are sort of, you can only do that when the barbarians aren't at the gates. I mean, what the real study of the humanities is for is to preserve and perpetuate a culture that one values, right? And, at this point, the barbarians are in the gates, or inside the gates. It would be nice to see a think piece on the value of the humanities that took a Camusian perspective and said, whoa. Ultimately, this is about perpetuating who we are as a culture, right? And things like your aesthetic sense and your moral improvement, those are sort of luxurious add-ons to what the real goal is.
Yeah. And one of the things, too, that I really appreciated about Camus is, as a conservative, and remember, we were talking to the European conservative in this interview, is how he doesn't let conservatives off the hook. He talks about our relentless march of global capitalism is erasing cultures. When I first came to Hungary in 2019, I talked to a man who's a teacher of English, high school English, and he told me he was an anti-communist, but he said victorious liberal democracy and capitalism have done more to erase the memory of Hungarian culture in the minds of the young here than 40 years of communism did. That's an extraordinary thing to say.
Mhm. Wow, that is very powerful. Well, uh, from, capitalism doesn't, I mean, I don't know enough about capitalism to describe it in this proper form. I guess the sort of globalized capitalism
Hmm.
that you're referring to, uh, it it doesn't want to have barriers, right, to consumption, to cheap labor, and so it can act as an acid, right, on culture, every bit
Hmm.
as much as wokeism can, right,
Yeah.
for very different reasons, of course. But again, we're back to this issue of the unholy alliance between the two, uh, and it's strange. It's something that transcends definitions of left and right, or understandings of the left and the right, and I think that's why it's hard for people to see and diagnose. But the reality is that there's tremendous resistance in the popular mind to things like mass migration in Europe. I mean, you look at polling coming out of France for decades, it's always 65, 75% of people, they want migration to be reduced. They think there's too much migration in France, too many immigrants, and yet this has found no political expression. It's
Hmm.
very strange. And the only thing that I can think of that explains that, and this is more or less the direction that Camus goes in, is that you have immense levels of complicity between the media class and the powers that be, and the interests that be,
Hmm.
and uh, how those ideas will eventually find their political hero. I mean, I guess you could say that Donald Trump, in some respects, represented that, but
Hmm.
in places like France, they've yet to find their uh, what's called the homme providentiel, the man of providence, to lead them out of this impasse.
Yeah, and Marine Le Pen, my French friends say, just can't be that person because of her family's historical associations with anti-Semitism and the far right.
Yeah, yeah. So there's Zemmour, but he's already passed the baton on to the younger crowd, um, to old Marine Le Pen's niece, and then there's Jordan Bardella, who's the leader, right? I believe of,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Well, so what does Camus mean by the second career of Adolf Hitler?
Well, the idea is uh, that what's called the reductio ad Hitlerum, right? The reducing of everything to Hitler, right, is a very, very useful way to silence opponents of anything that can be thought to even resemble, in the most remote and slightest way, anything that Hitler ever did or said or thought. So I'm talking about things like the notion of a people as a distinct identity, or a nation, or things like roots or origins, even if these aren't conceived of in a biological sense. And
Hmm.
Camus is clear that he doesn't conceive of them in that way. Just national identity as it's constituted over history, right? So if you're a dogmatic anti-racist, right, and you think that nations and borders are things that need to be gotten beyond, right, Hitler is a very, very useful tool, because you'll find something or other that he said here or there in whatever context that will allow you to use it as a cudgel to simply
Right.
silence the debate. Right. So it's a cynical and unfair tactic that he, spends this whole essay calling out.
And the Washington Post the other day had a headline saying like 20 ways Trump sounds like Hitler. And I thought it was a joke, but no, it was serious. There,
Yeah.
uh,
Americans, we love our lists. This is
listicles.
yeah. I mean, the result is that nations and peoples are left defenseless, because nobody wants to be accused of something that heinous, and
Right.
there is obviously like an understandable reason for this at some level. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable and obvious not to want to return to the horrors of excessive nationalism,
Mhm.
the horrors of concentration camps and extermination. Uh, the 20th century was, I don't know, probably the bloodiest century that man has ever known, even per capita. So that fear, that legitimate fear of returning to those demons, is manipulated cynically by people who have uh, they have an agenda, right? And so Camus calls this out, and of course he has to be condemned and vilified for
Right.
telling the truth.
Well, in the United States, we've seen in recent weeks the discrediting of Ibram X. Kendi, who is the great guru of anti-racism.
Mhm.
His center, his well-funded center in Boston, was has burned through like $30 million and has produced no research. So people, even liberals who gave him a lot of money, are having a second look at him. So why does Rénaud Camus call anti-racism the communism of the 21st century?
Well, I think we need to think of it in terms of what ideology polices the population, right? So in the Soviet system, you had the Gulag, right? So if you were an enemy of the state, if you were passing around samizdat, forbidden literature, and you were arrested, you were sent to someplace in Siberia, and you might survive and end up like Solzhenitsyn and write a great book about it, but more likely you would perish. So that was the Soviet mechanism, and so that was the terror, right? That reigned over people. It was always there, right? Oh, am I going to run afoul of the party and what the party says I ought to do and think? So anti-racism for Camus serves very much the same function. It's the thing of which we shall not run afoul, under pain of not the Gulag, but things like being canceled, right? Having your career destroyed, right? So it's not a physically violent form of coercion, but structurally it plays very much the same role in our societies that communism did, say, in the Soviet Union, during the Stalin era. And Camus does think that anti-racism, or we can call it wokeism, right, is though ultimately more destructive of culture. For the reasons we've already talked about, it needs to erase culture in order to perpetuate itself. And he claims that you never really saw that in the Soviet Union. They certainly didn't destroy their education system, right? They put a man in space before we did, right? So they had something going for them in that realm. And even you look at the music that was produced during the Stalin era, during World War II, you have these great symphonies by Shostakovich, by Prokofiev. And then you have to ask yourself, what high culture are cultures or societies that are suffused with wokeism producing right now?
Right.
I don't know. I've sort of given up on any movie made after 2014 at this point.
Yeah,
and
I hear you. I don't know if you saw this, but the Muslim apostate Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was famously one of the new atheists, she recently announced in London on stage there her conversion to Christianity. And she said in a subsequent essay and Unheard that the West cannot defend itself against its enemies, whom she identified as wokeness, as Islam, and as Russian and Chinese authoritarianism. It can't defend itself without recovering its ancestral faith. So a few years ago, this is how I first came to know about you. You wrote a great book called Without God, Michel Houellebecq and Materialist Horror, reflecting on what the celebrated French novelist has to say about the future of godless Europe. So what do you think Houellebecq and Camus would say about what Ayaan Hirsi Ali has claimed about religion and civilization?
Well, first, thank you for mentioning and praising my book. I always enjoy that and benefit from it. Well, Camus, I said this a little bit before, he doesn't think that Christianity is living enough in Europe. It's kind of half dead to be able to do the thing that she wants it to be able to do. So I don't know that he would say it's reprehensible to invoke Christianity in that way. And I know some people have criticized her as taking this instrumentalist view of faith. I don't think that he would go that far. It's more that he doesn't think that it's honest, at least in his case, to use a religion that he doesn't really believe in, right, to affect some sort of civilizational objective. Right. And then as with Houellebecq, Houellebecq is always, he's like the great French writer of what it means to be without God and how much that is unpleasant and impractical and ultimately destructive of a civilization. And yet,
and not a Christian himself, not a believer.
No, and yet he just can't quite bring himself, right, to where he seems to be trying to bring everyone else, at least at some sort of subtle level. When he started writing Submission, he imagined that the main character would, like Huysmans, the 19th century author that he discusses in the novel, that the main character would end up converting to Catholicism, right? But Houellebecq said, I just couldn't do it, right? So what's the alternative? Well, it's Islam. So my way of, if I had to guess how Welbeck would respond to this news of a conversion, he would, he would think that it probably just isn't enough, right? That it's impractical or futile in the end, because Christianity just isn't strong enough,
right,
in Europe.
But Welbeck does believe that every society has to have some sort of religion or something that functions as a religion, correct?
Absolutely, right? He does. I just don't think he has much confidence that Christianity is going to be able to do the job. And I don't know what I think about that. I mean, Europe is a very secular place. I mean, there are very strong minority communities of Christians that I know you have a lot of contact with, but is that enough? Right. And that's, at least for me as someone who's Catholic, right, who grew up with a strong sense of my family's connections to Europe, and Europe is something that we needed to look to and visit and travel to. To see all this going on is very painful. Not as painful as it is for Camus, who's a Frenchman, but I think I do have a kind of empathetic connection to the European who looks with dread on what's happening to his country.
Yeah, one of the books I keep promoting to my readers is a book by an American historian, Edward Watts, called The Final Pagan Generation. And he's writing about Roman pagan elite in the 4th century, which is the century when the empire made its long transition from paganism to Christianity. And, he talks about how if you go back and look at their writings, they don't see what's happening. I mean, it's happening right in front of them, but as long as the temples stay open and they can live off the nostalgia for the fact that Rome has always been pagan, that they didn't see it until it was too late. And I have a feeling that that's probably happening certainly to Europe and to the West in general vis-a-vis Christianity. And reading Rénaud Camus really makes that vivid.
Yeah, and despite the fact that he's not a Christian at all and kind of a pagan himself. Yeah.
Maybe outsiders like Camus and Welbeck are the ones who can see more clearly precisely because they're on the outside.
Yeah, I mean, Camus Welbeck was very instrumental for me. And, I grew up Catholic and kind of stopped going to mass when I was in college. But reading Welbeck, I realized, just what's at stake when you abandon not just your ancestral religion, but God in general. And I was horrified. So I wouldn't say I'm a perfect Catholic by any means, but I see what's at stake and why I have a duty to the faith I was raised in.
Right. Yeah. Well, finally, it seems to me to be pretty courageous to have translated and published Rénaud Camus, given how eager people in the academy are and in the media to slander him as nothing but a racist. Though, again, his actual writings belie that accusation. Are you concerned that either you or your co-translator, Ethan Rundell, will pay a price for this project, even though you neither endorse nor condemn Camus?
I'm not worried about Ethan at all. He's an obscure fellow living up in the mountains, so I think he's going to be fine. In my case, I'm not really worried either. If I were working at a major research university like the University of Wisconsin at Madison, or one of these schools that has a football team that you're aware of, it might be a little bit more thorny to me. But I really don't anticipate that. I have good relations with my colleagues, and I have tenure too. And Wisconsin is a state that over the last few years has been very good about expecting the universities to take a line that is very pro-free speech. So I'm in a good environment in that respect. And also, I write this in my introduction. I mean, Ethan and I really would not have undertaken this project if we thought that it would add any fuel to the fire of, white supremacists and other violent sorts of people. The term Great Replacement, it's already made its rounds on the internet. It's gone around the world. It's become totally viral. So there's not really any way to add anything to it in that respect. In fact, what the hope is that we would remove the fuel from the fire by showing actually Camus, he's not who you think he is. Right? He's not a violent person. Anybody who has appropriated him in this way is they've never read him, frankly. And, it's not, out of the question or entirely impossible that the term Great Replacement in English and the term Great Replacement as Camus invents it, they may be completely unconnected, right? It may be just that somebody came up with the term autonomously in English, perhaps because they were looking at the UN reports about replacement migration and thought, oh, a great replacement. So there's really not any clear evidence that his term is affiliated in any way with its English version. It may not be a translation.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, but as a scholar, I want to make, maybe somebody will write that history at some point. They'll figure out how this term arose, the connections between this person and that person. But for now, I'm actually kind of skeptical that he really is the originator of the English language term.
Well, I want to commend you for your work here, because one of the things that drives me crazy over the course of my career as a journalist is the way so many people want to avert their eyes from the serious problems in front of us. I mean, I first encountered this 20 years ago when I began writing about the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And but I noticed something there that was not at all particular to Catholics. It's human nature today that whenever there's a problem that we don't know how to fix easily and that challenges some of our primary convictions, we try to intimidate everybody else out of noticing. And it's destroying us, I think. And I'm so glad that you wrote this, or you translated this book, co-translated this book of Camus' essays, because he's a very important thinker. And it just makes me realize yet again why we can't trust the traditional gatekeepers in the media and the academy to tell us what we should and should not be reading, because they have an agenda there that's not necessarily in the best interest of free speech or the interest of liberal democracy or civilization itself.
Amen. That's very well put. Yeah, I mean, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this and get the word out there. The book, Enemy of the Disaster, Selected Political Writings of Rénaud Camus, right? It's available on Amazon in Europe, in the United States, and North America for anybody who wants to purchase it and learn about this really seminal master thinker that has been unfairly maligned and ignored in our age.
And I would also like to plug once again your previous book, Without God, about Michel Houellebecq and materialist horror, because you, more than anybody, helped me to read Houellebecq. I'd read his first book, translated into English as The Elementary Particles, and I understood what he was doing, but I didn't really understand it until I read your book, and that really gave me the understanding of how deep Houellebecq is. He can be difficult to read because he's so vulgar sometimes, but he's actually very deep, and he forces modern people to look squarely at some unpleasant things that we have no choice but to look at if we want to survive, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. And it's the same with Camus. I mean, the example that I always come back to if I'm talking to people about this is you look at the demographics of London between 1971, I think, and 2021. London was 82% white Britain in 1971 or 1972. Now it's about 36%. So, what are you going to call that radical shift? I mean, a term like Great Replacement seems to capture it if you were able to get rid of the connotations around the word. So, these things have to be named, right? Because they're real and they're causing, as we've seen just in the last month after the Hamas attack, great disorder. So Camus is, like so many thinkers before him, the guy who points out the thing that nobody wants to have to look at, right? But now it's being forced on people, and we'll see what happens.
Professor Louis Betti, remind me, what is your university? I didn't say it at the very beginning.
It's the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. So it's one of our I guess, 12 regional campuses. So UW-Madison is the flagship, and then Whitewater is about 45 minutes out of town. Yeah. So that's where I've been since since 2012.
Well, thank you so much for coming on with us today and sharing information about your book and about this really important thinker.
Hey, I really appreciate the chance to do so. Thank you, Rod.